It has been nearly 3 months since I last shot any kind of video on this project. I have been rather preoccupied with other things, and the pad stitching of this burlap interlining to my front panel has taken a very, very long time. But I've slowly worked away at it, and now we are finally at that most exciting phase, which is piecing everything together. Now, in my last video, I had been talking about the seams here and how it looked like they had been cased in, possibly even French seamed, to enclose the seam allowance. There was some talk about how I had kicked myself because after shrinkage and everything had been taken into consideration, I have negligible seam allowance left. This piece here pretty much goes right up to the edge of where the pattern piece needs to be. And while I would have loved to have French seamed this all together, I simply do not have the seam allowance for that. So mental note for the second half of this.
Unfortunately, I forgot that I cut the burlap and canvas for both halves at the same time, so though I made sure that the top two panels on the second half had more seam allowance, I was restricted by the underlayers and still couldn't treat the seams as I had hoped. Nevertheless, the second half actually went far faster than I had anticipated, much due, I think, to the experience that I had accumulated from doing the first half. I marked the channels, tacked the top two layers together, and cut out the panels. One end of the panels was reinforced for the cording process, and then the stitching began. I realized that I didn't have to roll the pieces over my finger when pad stitching because I wasn't trying to incorporate shape, which meant that it didn't matter which side the burlap attached to. It was so much easier stitching it to the canvas. Also, as I was merely securing the burlap rather than trying to lock in any shape, I used a larger stitch and wider gaps between the rows of stitches on the second half. It cut down the time dramatically. I aligned the 4 layers of the panels by placing a pin through the marked corner of each layer, and then pinned the assembled panels together in preparation for basting. I decided to handle the hip panels differently due to the amount of curvature. I rolled the panels as I pinned so that the shape of the hip would be locked in place by stitches, as it were. I did this by pinning down one end and smoothing underlayers as I curved the overlayers. If I lay the panels flat, you'll see where it comes up to my thumb here, but if I smooth the underlayers towards my thumb, you'll see how much it ends up overlapping. And if I try to lay the panel flat, it simply doesn't wish to comply. It wants to have shape. With all of the core panels assembled, by which I mean the hip panel and all that join onto it, I proceeded to prepare the busk. Given that generally the greatest strain is on the waist, I wanted to try to line up a loop and peg at the waistline. Once in place, I marked the remaining pegs with pins and then proceeded to use an awl to spread the fabric to receive the pegs. The peg side had to be done first so that the side with the loops could be aligned correctly. I didn't have a spoon busk, so I cheated for the sake of aesthetics. I sewed a line around my busk to make it appear spoon-like. Don't judge me, please. In attaching the busk panels, I only sewed the top 2 layers to the bust and hip panels with the sewing machine. I secured the back canvas by hand to make the join as tidy as possible. With the straightening effect that the busk had on the hip and bust panels, I was finally able to get a really good idea of how the corset would sit in its resting position, and it was glorious. As much as I love the look of a hand-sewn eyelet, the original does clearly show steel eyelets, so I went with that. I used pins to mark the position for the eyelets, observing that the photo showed the centermost 2 eyelets to be closer together than the rest. The final panels to prepare were those at the back. I found myself going back and forth between the photos and my interpretation more than ever. Much to my chagrin, I suddenly noticed a glaring error. And given that I was openly very picky about accuracy when first deciding on how to make this corset, it only seems right that I should openly admit my mistake.
There's the cording that runs up this side. So, to show here on my fabric here, so this is the cording here. And it runs up at an angle and then it sweeps in. So we've got it running up at an angle and sweeping in. And then you've got this 3-cord channel with a bone and then 3 cords, and 3 cords channel, 3 cords. The problem that I have here is that then when you come to the section that has the eyelets, there's a boning channel on the outside, there's obviously one on the inside, but then if you look at the distance between this and the cording, it decreases, it goes up. Well, this boning channel on mine is right here. So really, it would appear that this section should be at an angle, whereas mine, it goes straight down. Looks like on the original perhaps it should have been slightly at an angle, that this whole thing should have been, you know, kind of going this way, so that then this boning channel would be straight. Then you'd have your eyelets, and then this gets folded over here. So that's a little bit annoying, but I have to be grateful that that's really the only thing that I can see that I've done that deviates majorly from the original, so take it as it comes, I guess.
I used an awl to spread the weave wide enough to receive the eyelets. After making sure that all fibres were well pressed around the outside, sometimes with the aid of a pin, I used an eyelet setter to seal the deal. Lacing was the last step to make this a wearable corset, but once laced, wear it I did. I wore it while hoeing around the roses. I wore it while moving lawn furniture. I wore it while weed whipping here and weed whipping there, while mowing here and mowing there. I wore it while moving bricks, while helping to control the auger, while doing some editing, and even during those infrequent rest moments. I wore it for a total of 4 days of intensive gardening in 35° centigrade, 95° Fahrenheit heat, I might add, because if tweaks were needed, I wanted to make them before I'd added lace trim and finished my seams. How did it fare, and how did I fare? Stay tuned for the aftermath analysis in part 4.